Faith that moves mountains is the expression of the Christ consciousness. Where is your faith? The Master asked his disciples. There's more in that than what one would imagine. But Jesus, who had been teaching his disciples, no doubt, the faith that was in the mind is no faith at all, because the faith of the mind was a faith that lived in opposites. That Jesus was talking about was a faith of the Christ consciousness, as had been freed from opposites, freed from the mind of turmoil and conflict, to understanding the mind itself and all its fabrications and contradictions. So when he asked his disciples, where is your faith? It was a challenge to them, and it's a challenge to everyone. Now the faith that most people have is a faith in the mind. They ask, and they think by asking, that is a faith, but all the time they have also the image of not having. So if they have faith in having, while the image of not having is dominant. So the faith of not having causes fear. So the faith is having and the fear is not having. So you see that you have faith and fear in the mind in opposition to one another, just as you have the opposites of having and not having. So when you pray, your prayer is really a suggestion to the mind. Real prayer is something that is beyond the mind, because Jesus said, when you pray, go into your closet. That meant to say, away from the turmoil of the mind, into that secret place where alone dwells the Almighty. In that state where the consciousness is free from the mental fabrications you have through fear. Your fear, the ideas which are built upon fear are dominant, because fear has a tremendous force and a tremendous power upon the mind. It is always going in the opposite direction. And when one has that fear, an image based upon fear is much more powerful than an image built upon faith, because fear has much more power over the individual than faith. Faith is a hope, but a hope is always in the future. And in the future is nothing at all, it's merely a mental thing. If you look into your mind, you will see that hope is a mental idea. And that means hope in the future, which does not exist at all. And in the mind you have also hopelessness. So you have hope and hopelessness all together also in the mind. Both of them are in the mind. If you live in hope, you do not live at all. Because the only moment of living is now, at this moment. But when you live this moment, completely this moment, then there is faith, because there is no fear, there is no hope, there is no future, there is no past. The past is always influencing you now, and the clouds, they ever present, and what you are doing really is not giving expression to the present that is eternal and creative, but you're only giving expression to your past. And unless you discern your thoughts, your images, and your feelings, both in faith and fear, at this very moment, if you do not discern them, then you'll be giving expression to the conflict between the two. But if you are discerning these things and knowing them for what they are, you will see what the self is. The self is merely a bundle of images, a bundle of ideas, a bundle of hopes, desires, memories, experiences. These things are crowding out the ever-present and measured discernment. And when you are aware, you're discerning these things as they rise to the surface. And as you discern them, you see that they cannot exist in reality. It is not a real thing. It is merely the self that in itself has no foundation at all. So that is what Jesus said, I of mine own self am nothing. So that by knowing the self is nothing, then at that moment you know the self is nothing, then there is creativeness. Then there is the faith that Jesus taught his disciples. And that faith is tremendous power because there is no opposition to it. It is at that moment. And what happens at that moment, the whole universe comes into operation to fulfill. At that moment it's gone. That moment is gone, it's finished. It is actually created now at that very moment. Without opposition, with no conflict. And Jesus knew that continuously, and that's how the faith that Jesus had was the Christ consciousness. The Christ consciousness is a freedom from the mind that is held in bondage. And held in bondage to opposites, to hope, to the future, to the past. If you look into your minds, you will see you're merely living in the past and the future. The mind is full of all these things, but you think they are real. Knowledge can never reveal the ever-present, because the knowledge is always binding. Knowledge will never reveal that which is beyond knowledge. Knowledge is of the mind, but wisdom is not. Wisdom is a creative force that comes that very moment that you get beyond knowledge. So therefore, beyond knowledge is something that is eternal and ever-present. That's wisdom. That is creative. Jesus was clear in that moment. So he asked his disciples that question, where is your faith? I was born when there was no abysses, when there was no fountains full of water, ere he sunk the bases of the mountains, ere the hills existed, I was born. Proverbs 8:24-25. Showing that there was no beginning. If there's a beginning, there'll be ending. That which has a beginning must have an ending. And that which has a beginning and has an ending is not real. There's no reality, because it's relative. Reality never had a beginning and never will have an ending. The life that created the body must have existed before it created the body. It will exist after the body is dissolved into the substance out of which it was created. Life is the only thing that you live from moment to moment. The body is always changing. But life does not change. Life is like electricity. It in itself is free in the atmosphere. You make it relative by making it do things. But no one knows what electricity is. We know the laws of how to acquire and form electricity into certain forces, into certain forms, such as light, power, etc. But you can never use up the whole electricity, because it goes back again. Any form whatsoever goes back to the substance of which it became. So does everything else. Fear and faith are on the same yardstick with most people. One moment they measure with faith, the next they measure with fear. But one is up, the other is down, and vice versa. This kind of faith is of the mind, in which fear and faith exist as opposites. It is the seesaw of human existence devoid of understanding. Real faith of which the Master spoke is the faith that is not of the mind caught up in opposites, but a faith that comes when the mind is understood with all its opposites. its confusion, its ideas, its wants, its cravings, its having, its not having, its fears, its hopes, and all its other numerous contradictions. When these are discerned and understood, you are no longer caught up in them. Then a knowing comes, an awareness of the real. You do not know what it is, but you know with an assurance that it is. Words cannot describe the indescribable. Neither can words describe the faith that is not of the mind, but which is the expression of the Christ consciousness. You can't tell me what consciousness is. You can't even describe consciousness. You can't even make an image of it, can you? Try and make an image of consciousness. This knowing has no opposites, because it is creative in itself. Without this knowing, we react to the external, not realizing that the external is but a result. But this knowing is not a result. It's not the result of anything. It's a knowing that comes when the mind is completely silent, when the mind is free from opposites and confusion, when those confused ideas, conflicts, beliefs, and so forth are understood. There's no longer any conflict in mind when the opposites are extinct. Therefore there is a quietness comes, a stillness. It is not enforced. You don't force the stillness. You try to force your mind into a stillness. That's not a stillness at all. You still have conflict. Not until the mind is clearly discerned, knowing what it is and how the formulations come about, how you build up those formulations, how you build up those beliefs, what your faith is, what your hope is, what your hopelessness is. All these things must be understood. Then there is no longer confusion, anxiety, fear. Then there's a quietness in itself. It's like the lake. When the winds cease, the lake is calm. So it is when conflict ceases, the mind is calm. In that calmness, in that silence, there is the knowing, because itself, it can only be found in a mind that is free from conflict. You could never know it when your mind is in conflict, because you only know conflict. This knowing I'm speaking about is not the knowing of something that you know all about. It is a knowing that comes when you know all about what you know, and then know that it is not real. I cannot make it plainer, but words cannot describe this knowing. Yet it is within everyone. What you know about, you know. But that's not the knowing. That is knowing something about what you know. But when you know all about this thing, you know, and yet know that it is not real, then there is a knowing beyond that you cannot describe. It's an awareness. It's a knowing. I can't give you a word. You have to find it out for yourselves, because no one can give it to you. It is the Christ that possesses the mind and body, and not the mind and body that possesses the Christ. But that's the very thing that people do. You possess the Christ. You put the cart before the horse. The self is trying to possess the Christ. But the Christ is always external to the self then. The Christ is the livingness in man. It's the Spirit of God in man. And the Spirit of God is free. When the Christ consciousness is awakened, it assumes its true place, where all else is subject unto it. Jesus says, I choose you, you didn't choose me. Now, consciousness is something you cannot define. You may try, but you will not succeed. But consciousness will merely be defining something external to itself and still not know what itself is. It can only know that it is. It is this knowing that I want you to experience. You can experience this knowing only when the whole content of the mind is understood. Then what is in the mind is seen as that which is external and not eternal. And what is in the mind does not matter very much whether it is true or not. The Christ consciousness becomes one with the Father of all and knows the oneness in all. This is the true creativeness, because love must dominate every action that is created. Otherwise it cannot be created. There is no creativeness in hate. There is no creativeness in war. There is no creativeness in hope. Think now. When love is present, there is creativeness. You do not know what love is. It's not an idea. You can't make an idea of creativeness, and you can't create creativeness. Love is creative and is beyond the mind. What is of the mind is not creative because it exists in opposites and must dissolve into its native nothingness. But that which is creative remains to create, because love is God and God is love. Whatsoever you do into one of these, so you do into me. That is creative. Without this knowing and understanding, we react to the external, and so our creative power is turned in the wrong direction. So the things we feel, we get. What I feel came upon me, says Job. But every other person finds the same thing. Now if you discern in your mind what fear is, and what faith is, you will see they are merely mental expressions of experience and memory. You're living in the past and in the future. You see the past and future merely in your mind. You're giving expression to the past, hoping for the future. And all the time, this very moment is the creative moment. And what is created in that moment is eternal. Remember, it's eternal, because creativeness is eternal. And what is created in that moment, freed from opposites, freed from faith and fear, freed from craving, having and not having. There is a moment that's entirely clear and free when the mind is understood and all these opposites and contradictions are understood. And in that moment then it is created and eternal, and nothing can prevent that creativeness manifesting. No man, woman, or child, or angel in heaven you can prevent it taking place, because the whole universe comes into operation to produce through that creativeness. And when that creative condition is created, just as man is created, life is created, life creative man, that life that existed before the body was created the body. But what creativeness creates, you know it is relative. You must not hang on to your creation. If you hang on to your creation, you've lost your creativeness. Again, you're lost in the opposites. Then you will live in the opposite once more. You'll be afraid that your creation will fall away once you are caught up in fear and faith once more. You're back again in the same position as you were before. You must be clear in this point. Never hang on to your creations, because creativeness alone is real. That which is created is not real. It's like the body, has a beginning and an ending. It's like your experiences, has a beginning and an ending. Like your memories, a beginning and an ending. Anything that has a beginning and an ending is not real. So therefore I showed you clearly and distinctly. Now, discern your minds. Understand the opposites that exist in the mind. See where your faith is. If your faith merely is the existence in the mind that has fear, then faith and fear is the same thing. Just like believing and not believing is the same thing. Through lack of this knowing and understanding, we unconsciously use our creative power against ourselves. This is probably the biggest factor in creating our unhappiness and ill health. The reason for this ignorant reaction is because most people believe and act in separation. So man divorces himself from his divine inheritance because he lives in separation. He lives in his beliefs, his traditions, his truths, etc., which are merely mental images, ideas, and the recognition of his oneness is lost in this illusion. In this way, he becomes important while the other rules him. So God created man. Man created his memories, his beliefs. Man created his own conflicts. That's the self. The self comes into operation, and the self then gives itself a form of reality, because it hangs on to various things. It hangs on to the past, hangs on to the future. That's why it gives itself a reality. But immediately you come to the moment, this moment that is creative, the self does not exist. It can't exist. Both memories and hopes have gone. They have dissolved into this native nothingness, showing that the self is the cause of your miseries. You're living in separation in the past and the future, and never living in that moment that is created. That is your faith. That is the faith that moves minds. Life is spiritual, and our birth is a spiritual fact. The truth is that Christ is manifesting in the flesh, yet invisible to mortal eyes. Because of this, man worships idols, symbols, which have no power or life in them. So man repeats formulas, which he thinks is prayer. Only when he discerns how false these are will he arrive at the secret of the living Christ within. Only by understanding the false and knowing the true does transformation take place. Therefore, revival of the ignorance does not change man, only the Christ within it can do that. And transformation comes about not by man himself, that man can't transform himself. The self can't transform itself. It is when the self begins to dissolve away that transformation takes place. Transformation is merely the expression of reality coming into being. When man believes in a God and still retains the illusions of the self, with all its hideous fabrications, he cannot be a true disciple. Is it not so that we quarrel over our beliefs, our ideas and ideals, and have murdered each other because of them? And we do not know whether they are true or not. Isn't it very stupid? I think it's the most colossal stupidity that man could ever know, because he cannot reconcile his differences in his beliefs, his ideals and his ideas. We murder one another because of them, and then we do not know whether it's true or not, nor does it matter. It is only when we discern what these things are and how they make us murderers do we drop them. Now, these illusions, ideas, concepts which we accept and imitate are created by others who are ignorant of the truth about them. And the truth about them is that they are false. Any fool can see that when he begins to think for himself. But it's the most difficult thing for some people to think for themselves, because they're imitators. They're caught up in the belief and ideas of others. They can't throw off that imitation, and they're afraid to think for themselves, because they believe what they have already accepted is true. It becomes a belief, an ideal, yet they do not know how that ideal and belief has come about. Only by discerning these things do these things pass away, so the mind becomes free from the illusion of belief, imitation, acceptance, rejection. You understand the whole process of the mind and the process of thinking, and you will notice that your thinking is merely the expression of the past, of your experiences, your hopes, and so forth. It is not the expression of reality. Only when these things are discerned and understood is there reality. The blind lead the blind, and they all fall into the ditch. How true Jesus was when he said those words. We must give up the idea of becoming. Otherwise, we will never rid the mind of fixed ideas and beliefs. Why? You're becoming because you have fixed ideas. You're trying to become that idea, is it not? That's like the donkey, it's always chasing the carrot in front of it. It never catches it. Only when the mind is empty of all these illusions will we know that we are now. Then we do not need to worry about getting there by this route or by that route, by this creed or that dogma. For we are already there, but we do not know it. We do not create truth, and a lot of people think we do. We only create a concept of truth, according to our own conditioning, which is not truth. So are we conditioned by a particular form, religion, nationality, and whatever the case may be, we are conditioned. Therefore, we create our own ideas of truth, what truth should be. Don't you see how very stupid it is? As a matter of fact, I see the most intellectual people who are the most foolish people I've ever met, because they have created ideals and they're pursuing their ideals to the destruction of themselves and others. Truth is eternal and ever-present. Only when we dissolve the illusion of the mind do we find that which is eternal. If you cannot love your neighbor as yourself, then you have not found the truth, for your neighbor is yourself. Knowing that there is only one life, and life is indivisible. Now, what is it that hates the It's the self that hates the other self. It's the self that hates the self. And why does the self hate this? Because it doesn't like its own self. That is why you criticize another self, because that is deeply rooted in yourself. That's why you criticize others. But if you notice that in that criticism is the echoing of your own conditioning, then you will turn that criticism upon yourself, and that is virtue. Not trying to create an idea about yourself that you're not. That's not virtue, but everybody's doing that. And that's what they call virtue. But that kind of virtue can never solve any problem, can it? For there is only one. There is none other beside me. We live and move and have our being in Him who is infinite love. By our reactions to the external and lack of understanding, we are caught up in the external. Thus we cause our own misery through our ignorance. yet the living Christ within is waiting to manifest in all its power and glory. This is our only security. This is the faith that Jesus knew, and it is ours also. There is no security in the external, for here we are caught up in the stream of unconscious reactions and fear and anxiety, which leads us away from the Christ within, who is alone all-powerful and creative. Craving for security in the external causes insecurity in the internal, isn't that so? If you crave for security in the external, you're creating insecurity inwardly, are you not? So if you create insecurity in the inward, so you create it in the outward. So the cause of your craving for security takes away your security. There is no security in the external. There is only security in the creativeness that is free from opposites and fear and hope. Don't forget this hope, mind you. Although Paul hope meant hope, it was not hope. It was love more than hope. But even as Paul said that word hope, I know that that was in the mind. I know that hope was in the mind. I know that Paul now, if he really knew it, he would come and say that the ideal hope was not the hope that he thought of, but a hope that was beyond the mind, a love that was greater than anything else. And look into your own minds, you will see that hope is always in the future. It's not in the living present, is it? It takes you away from the living present. Jesus said, when you pray, believe you have received it, and you shall have it. Believe that you have it, and you shall have it. Now, at the present, now, this moment. He never talked about hope in the future. Let it be quite plain that God has always been manifest in the world, and the Christ of God is the love of God manifesting in the flesh. So wherever you see true love, you will know that's the Christ consciousness manifesting in the flesh. When we no longer live in beliefs in separation, then only will we know that God is all and is all. But if you believe in separation, then you're living in separation, are you not? That is in the mind. You will know that you are living in the mind, don't you see? The separation is of the mind, and it can't be real. What is a belief? What is an idea? Is it not something that's mental? It's not spiritual, is it? It's your own creation, is it not? And what you create is not spiritual. You can't create anything spiritual, because what you create is a beginning and an ending. Therefore it can't be spiritual. It can't be real. Only that which is spiritual is real. Now, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Our false beliefs must disappear before the Christ consciousness will manifest. Then we will know the faith that moves mountains through experiencing that faith in practice. Our state of consciousness is ruled by our conditioning when we do not understand our conditioning and how we have become conditioned. It is only when we know that our consciousness is free. The outer will always reflect our state of consciousness. It is easy for the one who has freed him herself to see how another is conditioned. But in that seeing there must be no condemning or criticism. In this way only can you free another. Because if you saw another's condition, condemning that condition, you couldn't be free yourself. The nothingness of the conditioning must be seen. The error must be seen and seen there. And when it's seen, when it's grasped and it's seen for what it is, an error, it passes away. You don't bother about an error again when you correct it, do you? It dissolves into its native nothingness, does it not? The law of mathematics is expressed through the mind. The mind does not create mathematics. The law of mathematics is expressed through the mind. It's only when we know ourselves are we free from criticism or conditioning. For what we see in another is but the reflection of ourselves. Therefore, the only virtue criticism has is when it is turned upon the self. What the inner is, so shall the outer be. When we know this, we can avoid much unnecessary suffering. Those who acquaint themselves with this understanding can specify with authority, knowing they are exercising powers bestowed upon them by the Almighty. Now, do not make the mistake, which most people do, making this recognition of the Almighty a mental idea, which is relative. If it is merely a mental idea of the Almighty, it is nothing. I wish I could actually demonstrate that very moment that it's created. But you cannot do it. Demonstration is a lie all the time. People talk about demonstration, but they're all in the mind. It's all got their opposites. They're all in confusion. If you can demonstrate now, you'll be able to demonstrate at any time. But because you demonstrate by a little bit of luck, sometimes your fear and faith becomes confused, and you probably see a little bit of your own suggestions coming into operation. Therefore, you think that you have demonstrated. But let me tell you this, it's an illusion. And it's a very dangerous thing to dwell upon these things. Most people are talking about a demonstration. I tell you, it's absolute rubbish. It's all about it. And anybody who tells you about it, you will know that they don't know what they're talking about. Look into your own minds and you will see. It's merely a mental creation, is it not? The realization of the Christ consciousness is not something apart from us. It is not relative. When we talk about the Christ consciousness of God, we put him in a relative position. And this makes him merely an idea and not a reality. Now we're talking about God, we put him in a relative position. We only create a mental idea of God, which is untrue, which is false. Now you're listening to me, and I don't want you to make an idea of what I'm saying to you, as I've often told you. I don't want you then to come away and say, Dr. MacDonald-Bayne, say not so-and-so, and I'm the authority for that particular thing that I have said to you. I am no authority. There is no such thing as authority. If there's any authority, it must be an illusion, because there is no such thing as an authority. What I am trying to do clearly is to show yourselves out, so that the self will pass away and there will be transformation. And if you listen to me only with knowing the self and understanding the self, then you're truly listening. But merely listening to some idea or make an idea of what I'm saying, then it's of no value to you, because one idea would just be superimposed upon another idea, which may be a little bit less. So I will say that these ideas are superimposed upon one another, and they're of no value to you. If you make a relative thing of God, then God becomes relative and merely a new idea. But the truth, the living truth, is not an idea. It's a living and a real. The thinking has ceased. Your past and future does not exist. Living is moment to moment. In that moment is created. Not an idea at that moment. The livingness of that moment. That's the Jews who knew that moment. The moment the past was dead. He knew that life and death was one. But in death there was life. And because he lived, he knew, he understood. That's why I said that the dead bury the dead. To put them in a right position and it makes them merely an idea, not a reality. Words can never reveal the real. You must search the scriptures, but you will not find eternal life in doing so. You can only find the real when the false is completely understood. Then we can speak the word of power from within, knowing that our word will not return void, but will accomplish that which is sent forth to do. At this very hour thy servant is healed. Jesus was conscious in that moment in the fire, in which there was no separation, there was no division. His very consciousness of the completeness of the Father living in every one was complete, was necessary. And in that complete knowing at that moment, there was no blemish. The servant is healed. I've experienced this myself. I've seen it done. It's come into my own life. I've seen it with my own patients, and many of them, instantaneous and complete cure. With this action comes knowledge which is not imitative, for this action is liberating and creating. Doing creates self-reliance, but knowledge which is imitative is binding. Book upon book weigh down our weary shells. The only point of ignorance is centered in ourselves. There are millions of people in sickness and misery who are ardent followers of the personal Jesus, but they have not made the great discovery of the indwelling Christ. There is no special state of learning required for one to renew the mind and body. Learning is mostly a hindrance, being purely mental. But the intelligence that built the body existed before it built the body and knows how to take care of it, much better than all the learning one can have. Then you try to reason it out. You try to make it a mental idea. Let me tell you this, that as long as you're trying to make it a mental idea and reason it out in your mind, you have lost it. It is now. You're merely trying to escape or trying to get a road to escape from your misery, your self-imposed misery. But you cannot escape from your misery. You've got to discern it and see it and know it. It is yourself. And your thought and your misery is yourself. You cannot separate yourself from it. It can only die when the self dies too. The self dies when you begin to know what the self really is. Then that which is real is there all the time. The expression of it. I of mine own self am that. The Spirit of the Father within me will do these things. The laws of nature are easy to understand and will serve us in exact proportion that we understand and observe them. The first is, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, with all thy strength. And the second is, love your neighbor as yourself. Very simple. I'm told by majority of people it is very difficult to do, especially the second one. But you cannot love your Lord thy God unless you do love your neighbor. That's the truth, you see. So you can't love God unless you love your neighbor. There's no getting away from it. Too bad that you can't do it, but I think you would like to do it, but it's impossible. The one is tied up with the other. There is no escape. Therefore, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you is not a mere command, but the law of divine protection. Choose instruction rather than silver, and knowledge rather than real gold. For wisdom is better than rubies. No treasure is equal to her. Proverbs 8:10-11. Benediction. O faith, where art thou? I read about thee in all the holy books, but could not find thee there. But when I realized that those words were written by another like myself, I searched within for the answer, and there did I find thee waiting to serve. O faith that is not of mind, thou art so mighty, but only as mighty as I am mighty in thee. Thou didst serve me well when I freed myself from my mental concepts of thee, for in my mind was the fear that thou wouldst fail me. But when I saw that fear was my own creation, I knew I could not create thee, for thou art beyond my mind, waiting to serve me. Then knew thou art the Christ within, O mighty